Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're decoding a really fascinating and honestly kind of confusing psychological mystery. We are talking about the people who quietly fade out of our lives. No grand speeches, no slamming doors, just a slow, almost imperceptible vanishing act. It's a phenomenon that leaves so many of us completely baffled. But, when we actually look at the clinical reality of what's happening behind the scenes, it completely changes how we understand human relationships.
Seriously, I want you to take a second and picture someone in your own life who pulled this kind of vanishing act. Maybe it was a close friend from college, a coworker you used to grab lunch with every single day, or even a romantic partner. You probably spent weeks or maybe even months replaying your last interactions, right? Wondering what you said wrong or staring at an unread text trying to pinpoint when this hypothetical fight happened that you've somehow completely missed. If you've ever been on the receiving end of this, you know that the lack of closure is incredibly frustrating. And I want to validate that emotional experience right out of the gate. It is super disorienting. But as we're going to see, just because there wasn't an argument doesn't mean there wasn't a very real process taking place.
All right, let's jump right into section 1, the silent departure. So we're looking specifically at relationship endings that have absolutely zero explosion. We aren't talking about screaming matches here, we're talking about pure silence. We have this cultural myth about how relationships are supposed to end. Just think about movies or TV shows. Society absolutely expects loud conflict. A betrayal is uncovered, voices get raised, maybe a drink gets thrown, someone makes a dramatic exit, and the credits roll. But the reality of human behavior, it's often just a quiet detachment. A lot of endings are simply silent, confusing exits that really don't fit that neat little narrative of a breakup. And when reality doesn't match our socially conditioned expectations of drama, well, we're left trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing.
Okay, moving on to section 2, defining psychological detachment. To actually find those missing puzzle pieces, we need to pivot away from the emotional mystery and look at the objective clinical reality of what's going on in the brain of the person who leaves. Let's slow down for a second and really let the gravity of this clinical definition sink in. Psychological detachment is the internal process of emotionally disengaging and setting boundaries, resulting in a quiet exit to preserve mental well-being. Notice the phrasing there. It's an internal process. It's about preserving well-being. By anchoring our explainer right here, we instantly separate this behavior from malicious intent. The person isn't sitting there plotting to ruin your week, they're actually just quietly packing up their emotional bags to protect their own mental health.
Now here is an absolutely crucial point. We have to understand the difference between two terms that get mixed up all the time: punitive ghosting versus psychological detachment. Punitive ghosting is weaponized. It's a sudden, silent treatment that's literally meant to punish the other person, usually driven by anger or trying to avoid accountability. Psychological detachment, on the other hand, that is a completely neutral mechanism of self-preservation. It's a shield, not a sword. The detached person isn't trying to attack you with their silence. They are simply retreating to a safe distance because the dynamic just became completely unmanageable for them.
Which brings us to section 3, why people simply vanish. So, if this is all about self-preservation, what exactly are they trying to preserve themselves from? Let's look at the why. Well, this process absolutely does not happen overnight. It follows a very clear step-by-step mini-narrative. Step 1 is emotional exhaustion. The person starts feeling consistently drained, unheard, or just overwhelmed by the dynamic of the relationship. They basically hit a state of mental burnout. And because they literally lack the energy to fight about it, they move to step 2, internal disengagement. They mentally check out. They completely stop investing hope or energy into fixing things. By the time we reach step 3, physical absence, the relationship has actually been over in their mind for quite some time. The physical disappearance is really just the final visible symptom of a long invisible disease.
When we view those steps neutrally, we start to see the ultimate truth of the situation. This internal process is almost entirely about self-preservation over punishment. They aren't walking away to teach you a lesson. They're walking away because they feel like they have absolutely nothing left in the tank. Keeping our perspective entirely non-judgmental here helps us look at the situation with clarity instead of resentment. Ultimately, they just chose their own peace over a prolonged conflict.
All right, section 4, no drama, just distance.
Now, what's really interesting is how this internal reality manifests in the real world, day to day. It brilliantly illustrates the huge disconnect between the two parties. A dramatic exit involves arguments, high emotion, and those totally grueling closure talks. Both people know exactly what's going down. But a detached exit,
That relies on quiet boundary setting, fading communication, and emotional withdrawal. For the vanisher, this is highly intentional, completely drama-free behavior. But to the receiver, who's sitting there waiting for the argument or the dreaded "we need to talk" text, it just feels like the Wi-Fi signal of the relationship is slowly dropping. The receiver is bracing for the storm, but the vanisher has already quietly left the building.
If we speed up a bit and look at the early warning signs, they're actually things we see every single day. Longer response times to texts, interactions that are perfectly polite but noticeably brief, a pattern of declining invitations with kind of vague excuses, and a total lack of initiation. Like, they'll answer your question for sure, but they won't ask you on back. These aren't just quirks, right? These are the highly calibrated, low-friction behaviors of a detached exit happening in real time. It's literally the art of stepping backward without making a single sound.
Okay, let's wrap this up with Section 5, what we can learn. So, how do we take all this clinical logic and actually apply it to our own personal lives, whether we're the ones leaving or the ones being left behind? I want to highlight this really poignant observation directly from the source material. Sometimes the healthiest boundary is simply a quiet departure. That single sentence completely humanizes all the data we've covered today. It fosters this deep empathy for both sides of the equation. For the person who leaves, it validates their right to protect their peace, without owing the world a dramatic performance. And for the person left behind, it offers a form of silent closure. It completely removes the sting of malice.
So your core takeaway from this explainer is to fundamentally reframe the vanish. Understanding psychological detachment turns what feels like a confusing, targeted rejection into a clear, totally understandable boundary. It's a psychological reality of how humans handle emotional burnout. It isn't necessarily a personal failure on your part, and it's not a character flaw on theirs. It's simply the absolute quietest way the human brain knows how to say, "Hey, I am at my capacity."
Which leaves us with a thought to turn inward. We've been analyzing why other people do this, but what about you? Take a look at the relationships, obligations, or environments that are draining your energy right now. Where do you need to set a quiet boundary in your own life? Because honestly, sometimes you don't need a loud exit to protect your peace. Keep that in mind, and I'll see you in the next explainer.